Why has this biochemist gone beyond evolution? I'm here with Dr. Garte. He's a biochemist and the author of this book, Beyond Evolution, which is getting ready to come out very shortly. Welcome, Dr. Garte. Great to see you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So this is really fun because I have to let people know that you're one of my favorite evolution believing scientists. And we share some passions in common. But would you just start by telling us, why did you write this book and what does it mean going beyond evolution?
Yeah. Okay. So I wrote the book because this stuff going on in the world of biology that is absolutely fascinating, and it has not reached the general public. Nobody's reporting on it yet. I'm sure that this will not be the only book talking about these things. There'll be a lot more coming. There have been a few articles, but not very many, if anything. And I want to share it with people because these new directions in biology are, I think, is very analogous to what happened in physics at the beginning of the 20th century when Einstein came up with relativity and Planck came up with quantum theory, and then they completely changed the world of physics. Before that, everybody thought physics was done. I mean, there were articles and books written about how we know everything, how everything works. We know about heat, thermodynamics. We know about motion from Newton. Everything physical was known. Even electromagnetism was well understood. And the only thing that people couldn't understand was the nature of light, because unlike anything else, light goes at the same speed, whether you're going towards it or away from it. So it's very strange. And nobody could figure out how that worked until Einstein came along. And of course, that changed everything because the answer to that problem was kind of crazy. It didn't fit with the very strict determinism that physics was following. In other words, the idea was that everything is relatively easily explained by certain laws and equations, etc. And if you knew starting conditions, you could predict everything. Quantum mechanics kind of threw a wrench into that, and things became a lot more complicated. And I often like to say that, what used to be considered supernatural or crazy turned out to be real science. So I think we're at that point in biology right now. We don't have an Einstein yet or a Planck. We don't have the answers to some of these very crazy questions, like how did life start? But what we are seeing is that physics and chemistry are not giving us answers to those questions. So there's something else. Now, if you're an absolute atheist, determined not to believe in a God, however you want to define it, then you can say, well, we'll eventually find it, but we're going to need, to be honest, you're going to have to admit that we're going to need new laws that we don't know yet that work in biology. And we're going to have to bring in old concepts that were banned from science and including biology for a long time, like the idea of purpose, of agency, of universal cognition. And I have a whole chapter in this book about those three things and how they're incredibly real, not just for us humans, but for all of life, including tiny little bacteria and single-celled organisms. So that's part of why I wanted to write this. Now, of course, if you're a believer or if you're considering believing, then what all of this does is it reinforces the reality that I believe and you believe and many of us believe, that science is not at all opposed to faith, not at all opposed to Christian religion, but in fact is harmonious with it, is complementary with it, and in fact supports it. So I wrote the book partially because of that. The book really has two major themes. One is that biology, as I said, is on the verge of just exploding. And to illustrate, sorry, I was reaching for a book, not my book. A book came out a year or two ago called Evolution on Purpose. A title like that would have been inconceivable 3 or 4, maybe 5 years ago. Not possible, because the idea of purpose was banned from science. It doesn't exist in chemistry or physics. We know that. Everything happens because of the laws of nature. But in biology, there is purpose.
Now, can you explain to people why would that be a banned idea in science?
It's a good question. One of the things about the scientific revolution, which really started with physics and then chemistry, was the idea that natural law determines what happens in the universe. Natural laws regulate everything. And of course, those scientists, those early scientists from Newton on down, and every scientist you can imagine, including people who started new fields like Boyle, who began chemistry, and Faraday, who began, the field of magnetism and electricity, and Louis Pasteur, who was one of the first biologists. They were all devout Christians. And, sometimes when I say that the early scientists were all Christians, people say, yeah, everybody was a Christian, so what? But in fact, they weren't nominal Christians. Many of them wrote as much about theology as they did about science, because what they strongly believed is that the reason the universe is governed by laws and can be understood is one of the gifts of God, that God created a universe that is orderly, regular, and understood by human beings. And that's a faith statement. So this whole idea that science is opposed to faith is just nonsense. It was made up at the end of the 19th century, written up in a couple of books, and then carried on by obviously Marxists and the growing atheist community around the world, philosophers, etc. But it's only about 150 years old, this whole idea, and it's wrong, and it's demonstrably wrong. And now to get back to your question, one of the things that some scientists began thinking as, I would say, almost a kind of scientific ideology is that, yes, the world is governed by natural laws, which means there's no need for God. Everything happens because of natural law. And if you have natural laws that determine when an earthquake, happens, or when a volcano erupts, or when, how the tidal forces go and why you get thunderstorms and everything. Volcano erupts, or when
I'm sorry. Please. Sorry, please continue. Started playing on my phone. Go ahead.
Okay. If that's the reality, then you don't need God, and everything just happens because of natural laws, and they don't have any purpose. And that's true. Okay, no volcano has any reason to say, hey, I think I'll blow up today, and goes ahead and blows up. I mean, it's natural forces that cause the eruption. And that's true of all of physics, and it's true of all of chemistry. Now, when biology started, it was very complicated, because biology was not considered a science for a very long time. It was considered metaphysics, because it was so complicated and nobody could understand any part of it for a long time, until they began, looking at the chemistry of it. And in order to establish itself as a real legitimate science, not just, some superstitious, weird metaphysical thing, biologists tried to imitate the physicists and the chemists. And they said, well, we're ruling out teleology, which is purpose. We're ruling out agency. because those things are not scientific. And you'll still hear that today, by the way. That attitude is not gone. It's probably the majority attitude among most biologists. And so that became, as I said, an ideological dogma that was rigid. And famous scientists have weighed in favoring that, including Francis Crick, Jacques Monod. I mean, many of the great pioneers of scientific molecular biology, and even today, many of them, Richard Dawkins, will say, there's the appearance of design, there's the appearance of purpose, but it's not real. It's only due to evolution. And that brings me to the second reason I wanted to write the book. The subject of evolution has become insane among Christians and among atheists as well. I have seen people arguing that evolution is not only wrong, but evil. If you believe in evolution, first of all, you can't be a Christian if you believe in evolution. And if you do, you're also believing all kinds of things like, sex is a spectrum and all sorts of political issues as well. On the other side, you have atheists who say, well, evolution disproves God. You don't need God if we have evolution. There's no need for God. So, anyone who doesn't accept evolution is an idiot. They're stupid, they're uneducated, whatever. It's terrible. And the worst part of this is that this split is also true in the church. So there are many denominations which completely accept evolution. There are many that don't. And you will get maybe some modification of the arguments that are going on outside the church, but it's basically a similar thing. There are churches which will throw you out if you hold evolution to be true. And there are churches which will throw you out if you're a young earth creationist. It's insane. So what I wanted to do in this book is show two things about evolution. First, there's nothing worth arguing about. Most people who argue about evolution, either in one direction or the other, don't understand what it actually says. Because if they did, they would stop arguing. It's not a big deal. The other thing is that evolution is now treated as, in fact, I believe I start the book this way, it's treated as one of the basic or the basic underlying rule in biology. And that's not true. It's not important at all. In other words, the case I make in this book is, first, most people don't understand what evolution really is. If they did, they would stop arguing. And second, it's not a big deal. It's not even a law. There is a theory of evolution, which is a theory of evolution by natural selection. But you cannot make that theory into a quantitative, predictive, mathematical law, because evolution is based on a concept called fitness. And fitness is indefinable and unpredictable. If you have a mutation which causes a change in the way a particular animal or a population of animals live, in other words, either they have a different function or they look different or whatever, you can never predict in advance whether that will be a positive mutation, which will allow for natural selection to select that group, or whether it'll be negative or whether it'll have no effect at all. In fact, it can change over time. It always does. And that's not predictable because there's no way to tell. And that can be proven. And I actually published a recent paper where I proved this mathematically. So if it's not evolution, what is it that is this fundamental thing that allows life to occur and also allows evolution to occur? In fact, requires evolution to occur. You can't not have it. And what that principle is something which is unique to life. Only life has this. and that is the ability of every living organism to replicate itself with high accuracy. Nothing else does this. And I have a whole chapter on this where I debunk the idea that crystals do it, that various other systems can do it. No, only life can do this. And that's critical because you need to have a very complex system of accurate self-replication in living organisms before evolution can start. And once you have it, evolution occurs automatically. It's not a big deal.
Well, now see, this is what, when I was reading your book, I was trying to figure out, when you say evolution starts automatically, the concepts that I got in your book was that kind of you were equating evolution with inheritance and evolution with self-replication. But I mean, like, plenty of people accept self-replication and inheritance, but we don't accept the idea that this can bring about changes.
Right.
That, yeah.
Okay. So
bring about, or wait, let me clarify. Change.
Sure.
There can be changes, but it can't bring about large scale changes like new systems and organs and things like that.
That is exactly correct. That is okay. When I say that evolution follows automatically from that, I'm talking about the microevolution type of change. When we talk about large scale change, major changes like going from one species to another, that gets very complicated. And I'm not saying that that's automatically occurs from accurate self-replication, because see, the thing about accurate self-replication is it's not 100% accurate. It's 99.99% accurate. So that little tiny error is what causes change eventually in a population, and you can allow microevolution with that. And nobody disagrees with that. And in fact, you know, in the book, as you know, I have a figure which shows the phylogenetic tree of cats as shown in the Creation Museum, Answers in Genesis. And they have papers which show this phylogenetic tree of cats splitting off into, you know, species from the original cat kind, which is an order. Now, that tree almost looks exactly the same as the phylogenetic tree that you find in mainstream biology. The only difference is that the creationist, the young Earth creationist tree, starts with the cat kind created at the origin of life, at the origin, you know, in Genesis, at the origin. Whereas the tree for mainstream biology goes further down, and it starts with a higher level of splitting, which it would be, you know, the carnivores. So the carnivores branched into bears, dogs, cats, and then evolution there. So that's where the difference is. And it's exactly what you said, Rebecca. It's the difference between, you know, going from a general cat kind and then having large lions and tigers, small pussycats. That's the microevolution part. They're all cats. The mainstream evolutionary view is that macroevolution is microevolution, slower and, you know, take longer time, but it's the same kind of event. Sometimes there are other events that are more radical that make these changes. But here's where the real controversy is, because the evidence for microevolution is incredibly strong, and that's why nobody disagrees with it. The evidence for macroevolution is, I will admit, as an evolutionist, it's not quite as strong. So yeah, and in fact, in the discussion I recently had with Doug Axe at Discovery Institute on Sean McDowell's channel, which I would recommend to people for a number of reasons, that is the place where the data is good but it's not as good as it is for microevolution. And there are even some, I will now say, and this is the first time you're hearing this from me, there is room for doing better in that particular area. And I'm looking at it right now. I'm working on it now, so I don't want to really say much more than that. But
oh, okay. So, because I was going to ask you, well, what is the evidence that you think is good? I mean, if you don't want to go into that, we don't have to.
Yeah, it gets really technical because it has to do with things like you have large events like retrotransposon insertions and whole genome duplications. And the theory has always been that those things lead to really large changes in the way, in a few generations in a population. The problem is the evidence for that is not as strong as I used to think it was. And this is a result of my discussion with Doug. So I'm looking into it further and we'll see. But but the fact remains that this is something that we can disagree about. This is why I mean, you and I, scientists in general, Christians in general. But the reality is it's not worth arguing about because it's a very technical scientific issue and it doesn't matter. If it turns,
yeah. What? No, I want this. I'm glad you brought it back to this because here I am. And for those watching who don't know me, I'm a young earth creationist. And the entire purpose of my channel is basically to bash on evolutionary ideas, natural processes bringing about an orderly universe, natural processes bringing about evolution and the origin of life. So I definitely think it's worth arguing about, but at the same time, we're sort of kindred spirits in that I don't want it to be something that divides Christians. Like I love that you believe in evolution, because I know there's people I'm not going to be able to reach. I know there's people that believe in it so strongly that they need to hear from Christians like you who embrace evolution and, embrace Christianity. So I'm glad that you exist with your perspective because I think you're helping people. That being said, I don't think evolution is true. And I'm passionate about telling people about that, because I think the whole idea is blocking a lot of people from being able to see the evidence that God has given us for his existence. So what do you think about that?
No, I understand that. And I've heard that from many very smart people who know science and who are strong believers in Christ and find evolution to be problematic in exactly the sense you just said. And what I think and believe very strongly is that the evolutionary ideals or ideas have become another part of the atheist ideology that has infected science. So just like I said before, the elimination of purpose and agency is part of atheist ideology. They need to have it, because remember that the current atheist ideology, which is best articulated by Richard Dawkins, is that the universe at bottom has no purpose, no meaning, no good and evil, all that stuff, and it's all pitiless indifference. As Christians, we believe exactly the opposite. The universe at its bottom is carefully designed, full of purpose, meaning, love, good, evil. That's what we believe. It's exactly the opposite. Now, many Christians and many atheists agree that evolution disproves the existence of God and supports the Dawkins view. Certainly Dawkins says that himself all the time. If evolution were wrong, it could be proven not to exist, he would probably come to faith because he would have and that's true for many people. Now, my view is exactly opposed to that. I do not believe that evolution has anything to do with atheism. It does not support atheism. You can make a case, and I don't have the time to do that now, unfortunately, maybe my next book. I make the case, and I'm not alone on this. I know several other people who've made it, that evolution is actually evidence for God, for the existence of a creator, a divine creator. One of the people is Jim Stump, who is the vice president of BioLogos, and he's an evolutionary creationist, certainly holds to evolution. And he just recently published a book called The Sacred Chain. And the subtitle, which I don't remember exactly, is something like How Evolution Supports the Hypothesis of God. Okay, so now he's not a scientist, he's a philosopher, but he knows a lot of science. I believe that there is scientific evidence that the evolutionary process, however it ends up being, whether it's only microevolution or whether it's microevolution plus or whatever, is indication of a divine designer, not indication of nothing, not an indication of just random chance, natural forces. There is no natural force in the universe that would explain evolutionary workings. So what people like to say is that, yeah, but evolution is just random mutations, and then you get natural selection, which selects them. That's more or less correct. But now, here's something, for example, that is not in my book, which I probably should have put in, but I didn't. The key thing in evolution, in the mechanism of evolution, is the environment. It's the environment that determines whether a mutation that leads an animal to have longer hair or shorter hair, either one, will be good or bad. If the environment is cold, longer hair is better. If the environment is hot, shorter hair is better. So it's the environment that determines whether and how evolution works. Now, here's what I believe. The environment is produced by natural forces, yes, but not only. It's also easily controlled by the Lord. And think about all the verses in the Bible that talk about, the book of Job is full of it. All the verses in the Bible that describe God having an effect on the environment, on weather, on rain, on even Jesus told the fig tree, you're done because you're not giving fruit. This is the area which is the most important. It's more important than mutations. Mutations, if the environment were constant, mutations would have no effect. You have to have, in order to have evolution, you have to have all the characteristics of our planet. And here I would recommend Hugh Ross's book, Improbable Planet, which is brilliant and talks about how, life could occur on this planet because it's so unusual. And one of the things that's amazing about this planet is that nothing stays the same. There's constant change. The temperature changes, the dryness and wetness changes. And interestingly enough, there was a period in history of the Earth when one particular area, which was northern Africa, was changing constantly, but from hot and dry to cool and wet, like every few thousand years. It was weird, really weird. And that was at exactly the time that ancient hominins were hanging around in northern Africa. And within that period of all this rapid change is when we think the earliest humans developed. Now, I'm not saying evolution created humans, because one of the things I believe is that human beings are created by God. I do believe in Adam and Eve. So
now, what do you mean by that? Do you take a view like Dr. Swami Das, where, basically there were hominids, but at some point, there was, can you just explain your view?
I kind of go along with Josh. I do. I think that's a very reasonable hypothesis. Josh Swamidass, and I think that it's scientifically valid. It cannot be questioned on scientific grounds because it works scientifically. Now, whether that actually happened is a question we'll never know, But I think that that's certainly a possibility. I think it's also a possibility that evolution produced human bodies, but not. And I have a whole chapter on this in the book called Consciousness. There's no way to explain human consciousness through evolution. People have tried, and they just hand waving. There's no evolutionary understanding of how humans became what we are, which is creative. We're in the image of God. We have a spark of divinity in us. We can make incredible music. We can make jokes. We can, write books. No other animal comes close to any of this. And I talk about this in my first book, The Works of His Hands. I have a whole rant where I talk about no other animal. And, and it's a whole list of things that no other animal can even come close to doing. And we do it. And how and why, and evolution cannot explain the answer. I believe that very firmly. So, in that sense, I'm already deviating a little bit from the strict evolutionist viewpoint. And I also know, and this is not alone, all biologists know that evolution cannot explain the origin of life. So it's an irrelevant argument to say that evolution is wrong because it doesn't explain the origin of life. Everybody agrees with that, including Dawkins. So we don't know how life began, and it's not evolution.
Well, there's a lot of people that seem to be very confused about that because a lot of people believe that science has explained or is close to explaining the origin of life. So can you set the record straight for people? Yeah.
Yeah, it's not even close. So here's what's happened with the origin of life. There have been several stages in the research going on. And every now and then you get a thing which is like, oh my God, that must explain the origin of life. And the first one was 70 years ago with the Urey experiment on the idea that it could have been a primordial soup, which lightning hit it and you get all these chemicals. No, that's no longer considered valid or reasonable for lots of reasons, which I don't get into. But and then for a while, everything it seemed almost impossible to come up with any reasonable theory. People were thinking, well, maybe metabolism came first, and then others said, no, it had to be replication of DNA first. And then a discovery was made about RNA, that RNA can both replicate itself and also act as a catalyst, like enzymes do, like proteins. And so that seemed very interesting. It was called RNA World. And the idea was that RNA developed first, and since it was one molecule, which could both replicate and also catalyze reactions, both metabolism and replication occur at the same time. Voila. Solved, right? No, because RNA World was very hot for many years, but starting 3 or 4 years ago, it began to decline, and it's now gone. There's no one who seriously says RNA World came first, if they're actually a scientist. And the reasons are complicated, but basically, it turns out RNA is not that great a replicator, and it's not that great a catalyst. So it doesn't do either one very well. The other one is actually one very good scientist who I've actually talked to has shown in a very difficult paper, but it looks accurate, that it's impossible for RNA World to lead to a DNA world, a DNA code world. So RNA is kind of dead, and people are looking at other things like RNA plus peptides together. But the reality is, look, and it has nothing to do with whether you can make RNA or whether RNA can do things like form by itself, reproduce itself. It has nothing to do with how do you put a protein together from different amino acids. The problem is we can make everything. We can make all the enzymes we want. We can buy them from stores. We can make RNA, we can make DNA, we can make lipid membranes with proteins sort of stuck in. We can do all these things, and we put it all together and you don't get life. Nothing happens. So it's not chemistry. It's not chemistry that's the problem. And though chemistry is a problem, you talk to James Tour, you'll hear all the problems. And he's right about all of them. It's extremely hard to come up with RNA that you're not making in a lab, just have it, sit there and it forms itself. No. But even if it were, even if you could get all the chemicals together, we have no idea how they become alive. We just don't know. And one of the problems there is the biochemical machinery. And I talked about self-replication. Self-replication is one of the most complex processes in the universe. I mean, we have not made any machines or any systems as complex as as protein synthesis, which is what's required for self-replication. So where did that come from? How did that possibly start? We have no clue, literally no clue. Now, James Tour, myself, and many other people in this particular view are not saying that it's impossible, okay? Because you could never say that anything in science is impossible. But what we are saying is we now don't have any clue. And I go a bit further and say that I think we've proven that chemistry and physics that we know won't do it. So we need something new, or I should say, or we need God. We need a divine creator to get life. And I make that point in the book as well, in my chapter on abiogenesis.
Yeah. And so how do you see that happening? Because in your book, what I thought was really interesting is that you quoted Genesis, where it says each was created after their kind.
Right.
And you actually focused on that concept of kind.
Right.
But I mean, I was a little bit like wondering, well, what does he mean? Because actually, if you're focusing on that language of kind, how does that come together with the idea of all things evolving from like a single-celled ancestor?
So what the Bible is saying in Genesis is, I believe, two things. First, it's saying what everyone knew in the ancient world, and we still know today, and people have probably always known, is that no sheep ever gives birth to anything but a sheep. And that's true for every animal and every plant. The argument I've heard from some young earth creationists that you can't go from, I'm not going to mention any names, you can't go from an elephant to a pineapple or whatever. It's just nonsense, because nobody has ever claimed that anything like that happens. What happens in evolution is sheep give birth to sheep. Lions give birth to lions. Only and always. And that's critical for biology. It's critical for evolution. It's critical for everything. So there's no argument with that. Now, in the book, I'm saying something slightly different. I'm saying that the reason that that verse, according to their kind, is repeated, 20, 25 times in that small section of Genesis, Genesis 1, is that what God is telling us there is, this is really important, folks. Pay attention. And what does it mean when you say that each according to its kind? You're saying it comes from accurate inheritance. Okay, so sheeps give birth to sheeps, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if that is what I'm saying, how can I go along with evolution? Well, the reason I go along with evolution is, yes, let's go back to the cats. There was a population of cats that gave birth to everything that looked just like them. And then that population split in two. A bunch of cats went to Asia and the others stayed in Africa or whatever. And so they were not mating with each other. So now you have small variations that go on naturally. Okay. Lion, the group in Africa, for some reason had a mutation, maybe just spontaneous. And it turned out that mutation was useful because it helped them, avoid being seen by their prey. And let's say it was stripes. No, that's the tiger. Sorry, I got the wrong animal. Let's say the tiger, the animals who went to Asia ended up with stripes. Now, that didn't carry through to the population in Africa because they couldn't reach each other. They weren't mating with each other. So the two populations began to diverge, because here's the key thing in evolution. Evolution does not occur in individuals. No individual ever evolves. That's only in Pokemon. Evolution occurs in populations only. So the definition of evolution is a change in allele frequencies, which means a change in genetics in a population over time. So if you take one species, you divide it in two, you have two populations. And this is what Darwin saw with the finches in the Galapagos Islands. They couldn't interbreed because they were too far away. And some of them got longer beaks and some of them had shorter beaks, depending on what they were eating and all that other stuff. That's what evolution is. That's all it is. And so it's incredibly important that every creature gives birth to itself, basically something that looks just like itself. And the variations that occur are very rare and very infrequent, but when they are useful, they build up. And over a great amount of time, that population becomes smaller or larger or faster or has better eyesight or whatever. And that's due to evolution by natural selection in that population.
Now, I agree with that. So, but where do you see, because obviously, we had to get at some point a new organ to develop, a new system. Right. So, and we have to have that many times.
Yes.
So where do you see that happening?
That's the hard part. That's very complicated. And some things there are theories for how it happened. For example, mammalian pregnancy, okay, which basically defines mammals. Okay, we don't lay eggs. We have children, in the womb. And one thing that apparently happened was something called a retrotransposon, which is a whole piece of DNA that moves from one place to another and does lots of things. I don't think it completely explains it, but it does give a hint as to the kind of thing that might have happened. Again, this is like the whole genome duplication and other very large events, which are rare, very rare, much more rare than single mutations. But when they occur, the theory is that they lead to very large scale changes. Again, I'm not going to defend that because, as I said, I've been recently reading more about it, and it's a little trickier. But that is the theory, and whether it's true or not, we're going to find out, because that's what science eventually does. It finds out.
Cool. Well, I love how open-minded you are, Cy. You're amazingly open-minded, and I wanted to go back to talking about, because you started to talk about it, about the new thing that needs to be recognized in biology. And in your book, you said there's 3 things that really need to be embraced. And I think it was agency, cognition, and teleology.
Right.
So can you talk about why do you think those have to be embraced in biology?
Yeah, because they're real. and because, as I said, the only reason that all biologists are not accepting it right away, this book that I held up before, Evolution on Purpose, this was published by MIT Press, And I don't think there's a single editor or writer of chapters in this book who is a professing Christian. I may be wrong, but I don't know of any. So these are mainstream biologists who are brave. They're bucking the trend because they see the reality of this, of these concepts. They can no longer say, no, we don't agree with that because it brings in, it's the camel's nose. If you start accepting purpose, then next thing you know, you're believing in God. Well, that may be true, but the point is, it's still true that there is purpose and agency. And at this point, the writers and editors of this book are willing to put their necks out and say, look, guys, we're not Christians, we're not theists, but this is true. Now, my view is, yes, you're right, it's true. And it does lead to questions saying, how could there be no God if tiny little bacteria, the earliest and simplest life form, make decisions, have purpose, act on that purpose through their own agency, and do all these things that are typical of life? In other words, life is really special. And it's not just us who are special. We are most special, I agree. But we are not the only special. All of life is special. And none of this can be explained through chemistry and physics.
Can you give some examples of how even simple life forms are showing agency? And
yeah, and there's lots of details in the book. But for example, if you do an experiment where you take bacteria, certain species of bacteria, and you deprive them of oxygen, or you lower the oxygen content in the atmosphere for them, they will modify their metabolism in a way so that they can survive on a slightly lower oxygen level. Okay, can't go into details, but that would get very technical. But they're able to do that. Not all of them. Many of them will die, but some of them will hypermutate so that they get a lot of possible new genes or gene forms. And hypermutation is well understood. And it shows, by the way, hypermutation shows cooperation by these single cell organisms because they all have to mutate at the same time. And the survivors who are lucky, who have the right mutations, will then repopulate the colony. So let's say they do that, or they already have an alternate system in place, but it's not operating because the genes have turned it off. Now you lower the oxygen level, that system goes into being, and everything's fine. The problem is it takes a little time to do that, and a lot of the cells will die. Now, suppose you do this experiment. Just before you lower the oxygen level, you raise the temperature by 1 degree, a little bit. And then you lower the oxygen level. Now, if you do that several times, those bacteria learn that when the temperature goes up, the oxygen level is going to drop later. And they start the new metabolic process early, even before the oxygen level goes down, because they've learned that the temperature is followed by the oxygen. The temperature rise is followed by the oxygen level change. So when the temperature rises, they've learned, like Pavlov's dog, right? They've learned that now, okay, there's going to be a change in oxygen, so we got to start it early. So that's pretty good. And now, if you do that experiment a few more times, they get it faster and faster. Now, if you don't do the experiment for a while, the colony grows. It forgets. There's a point at which you'll do the temperature change, and they don't do anything. So you do it again, and they catch on even faster.
So they're showing an intelligence, they're showing an ability to learn.
Right, exactly. Ability to learn.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And the other thing is that these bacteria, these cells talk to each other. They know how many of their friends are there. And when the friends, and when there's several examples of this, when their friends are at a certain level, a certain degree of density, some bacteria will suddenly begin to emit light. Now, why does that require? That requires a mass of bacteria together, because one bacteria putting out some light is useless. Nothing happens. But if you have 10 million bacteria all putting out a light signal at once, it gets a flash of light. And that's used for various purposes. The same thing, they will also do that with toxicity. If they're faced with an enemy that's attacking them, and they have enough of them there, they will all put together, they will all emit a certain poison that will kill the predator. And this is like so just like all other animals and most plants, they are sensing their environment, they're getting signals, they're acting on the environment, and they're acting. The acting part is agency, and their purpose is to survive. So they have agency, purpose, and of course the cognition, which allows them to function. I mean, it's remarkable. And there is no chemical way, or well, it does involve chemistry, but there's nothing within physics or chemistry that would predict this to happen unless you have life. And again, we cannot define what life comes from. We don't know.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, one of the amazing things to me is what we're learning about, like, gene regulatory networks.
Oh, yeah.
And I think you mentioned this in your book as well.
Yeah.
So,
well, I've written papers on that. I've written papers on hypermutation. The gene regulatory networks are unbelievable. And I started working on this several years ago just because it was kind of a new thing, and I couldn't believe the complexity involved. And I had no idea. I mean, I actually, at some point, I decided this is too hard for me, and I couldn't continue. I was doing model gene regulatory networks, and it's just amazing. And what is that? Okay, well, genes, in order to work, in order to have any effect, they have to be expressed. In other words, they have to produce an mRNA, which then goes to the ribosome, makes a protein, and that does the thing that the gene is supposed to do. Well, so that's called activating the gene, or turning it on, expressing the gene. Most genes are not expressed all the time. They're only turned on when they're needed. How do they get turned on? By gene regulatory networks. So you'll have one gene, which when it's expressed, turns on 3 other genes, one of which will turn off the original. The other one will turn on 2 other genes. One of those will turn off the whole thing. The other one will turn off half of it. I mean, it's insane. It's a level of complexity that is unfathomable. And that goes on in every living animal, including, invertebrates, everywhere, plants everywhere. And there's no theory on how this could have possibly developed. I mean, it's just too difficult.
Well, and getting it now on a one-celled organism, you could maybe understand, but when you take something like a human, any mammal, anything like that, or organisms that have so many different levels.
Right.
Okay. Then what's interesting is how do these gene regulatory networks know what is needed? Right. Like, so there's an awareness of what's needed on the macro level of the organism, and then it's done at that cellular level, which to me is amazing.
It is true. Well, I'll tell you something. You speaking about one thing you just said now is one of the greatest mysteries in evolutionary biology. Even if you accept evolution completely, there's a question which is incredibly difficult, which is you have single cell organisms, right? That's how we believe life began, with single celled organisms, if you're an evolutionary biologist. But then we have multicellular organisms. Now, single cell organisms compete with each other. how do you get them to stop competing with each other and cooperate with each other to be in the same organism? How do you get multicellular organisms? There are very primitive organisms, slime molds, which go through a unicellular phase, and then they all get together in a body and they reproduce in an amazing way. There are some cells which have now functions that the other cells don't have. They reproduce. And it's just an amazing story. And we don't know how that basic concept of I am my own organism, I'm competing with every other organism for food, for everything, mates, everything. And now all of a sudden I'm joining up with this guy who I used to be competing with, and we're sitting together in a in a buffalo or something. I mean, how did that happen? We have no clue about that.
And you mentioned that in your book because you mentioned how the mold, like, it has to be self-sacrificial.
That's right. Some of the cells form a stalk to allow the reproducing cells to get to the top and distribute themselves in the air. And those stalk cells just die once they're done. They just fall down and dead. Yeah. What living cell will say, gee, I think I'll give up my life to help this mold? I mean, where did that come from? We don't know.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so I wanted to bring up a couple of questions that people had for you, if that's okay.
Sure.
So Pigs Can Fly says, Dr. Garte, have you seen the peer-reviewed papers written regarding mutator genome decay at the NIH or NCBI? Wouldn't that impact the theory heavily, implying that no such changes can accumulate?
Oh, that's a really complex question. I know what mutator genomes are, but I don't know about the decay. So I don't think I've seen those papers. So I'd have to look for that. NCBI. What is NCBI? National.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Okay.
Anyway, no, I'll look into it. I don't know what that is. Let's see. Wouldn't that impact the theory? Changes can accumulate. Yeah, I can't answer that. I have to.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Good
Thanks for your question,
Yeah.
Matt. That's Matt from Pigs Can Fly. Travis says, does the Bible support evolution?
I don't think it talks about it much, but the Bible, there are so many ways to read the Bible, and I read the Bible in different ways depending on what I'm reading. When I'm reading the New Testament, I'm reading what I believe is history and reality and fact, and I don't do a lot of overinterpretation. When I'm reading something like Genesis or some of the other books, which are stories in many cases, Genesis certainly includes stories. Some of the chapters. Genesis 1, I think, is a beautiful depiction of creation. I don't think it's meant to be factual, but that's my own view. I'm not a theologian, so I'm probably going to say a lot of stuff that's easily refuted. But whether it supports evolution, I mean, you could ask whether the Bible supports gravity. I don't think there's anything in the Bible that says the theory of gravity is what makes things fall down. It's just not discussed. And I do think, however, as I said before, that when I noticed this, actually was pointed out to me by a friend and colleague, that that each according to their kind is repeated so often, and there is something in the Bible that is consistent about that idea of repetition. When something is repeated a lot, it often says, pay attention. I mean, even Jesus spoke that way often. Truly I say to you, or verily I tell you, is something that means listen to what I'm saying, and he says it a lot. Now, in terms of evolution, does according to their kind support or refute evolution? I believe it doesn't really address evolution, but it addresses the key thing in life, which is accurate self-replication. That, you know, listen, folks, things only give birth to themselves, to their own kind, to their own species, whatever you want to call it. And I think that is, as I say, that I think is the key point of biology. And from that, once you have that happening in entities, they become alive. And without that, they're not alive. So, yeah, I think in that sense, I would say that the Bible supports scientific biology in that sense.
Cool. Thank you. Well, for those who just started watching, I want to put up Sai's book. This is the book that's going to be coming out. It's available on pre-order. It's Beyond Evolution. And I think there's things in this book that you can enjoy, whether or not you believe in evolution. It's a great book, just like all of Sai's books. And I will mention Sai has several other books, The Works of His Hands, awesome book, and Science and Faith in Harmony. So let's bring this back around to, how do you see bringing Christians together on this issue?
I don't know if we can bring Christians together. I think that I would say that one of my heroes, Francis Collins, has written a great book called Road to Wisdom. And in this book, he talks about several controversies that he was involved in. The main one being the COVID situation. And he talks about having conversations with people who did not agree with him at all about COVID. And he discusses the concept that you can disagree about things, but there's a way to do that which can actually lead to friendship and fellowship rather than enmity and hatred. And, you know, I think this is critical for Christians. I don't think he was talking about a specifically Christian situation, but I think that in terms of what's going on in the world today with, I'm a boomer. I've seen all kinds of stuff in the last 70 years. And this is one of the most scary periods I've lived through, with so much antagonism and hatred going on between people who don't agree. And so what I think is, in answer to your question, Rebecca, is that we can you and I disagree. We've disagreed on this thing for how many years? I've lost count. But we're great friends. And we have a great time together when we're together. So I think we need to understand how to disagree. And it's not that different. By the way, this is an old tradition in Christianity. Just look at one of my favorite chapters, Acts chapter 15. That was the first major disagreement within the church. Should every new person, should every Gentile coming to faith become Jewish first? Observe the dietary laws, get circumcised if you're a man. And it was a big argument. Eventually Paul and Peter were able to convince the council in Jerusalem to have a compromise, which was just follow some very simple dietary laws, like don't eat food sacrificed to idols, and the rest of it, fine, whatever. And it worked. And that's the first, but not the last controversy there. I don't have to go into Christian history to talk about, and look at all the denominations we have today. I am not a Catholic. When I came to faith, I thought I would be a Catholic, but I ended up being a Protestant. I don't understand the hatred between some Protestants and some Catholics. It's insane. Jesus Christ is the center. He is the truth, the way, and the law, and everything. And once you have that, and once you understand the significance of his death and resurrection and his role as the savior of humanity, the rest the details, the evolution doesn't matter in that context. The papacy doesn't matter. I know this would be controversial to a lot of people. And of course they do matter in some way, how you live your life. But I just think all of these things are okay. We don't agree, and Rebecca knows this because she said a lot of things that a lot of her Christian colleagues don't agree with. And, hopefully they will understand that who knows who's right. I just recently, in the last few days, have had has been brought home to me that some of the things I thought were true may not be, and that's something you have to be open to, certainly if you're a scientist. And I don't have a lot of patience with my scientific colleagues who will say things like, nobody can rise from the dead. How do you know that? I mean, are you sure? Especially that somebody is God incarnate. Maybe that is possible. Anyway, I think everybody needs to be more open, and not just Christians. I mean, it would be great if we could have the whole world saying, well, I don't agree with you, but you seem like a nice person, so we'll be friends and we'll discuss it, and one of us will turn out to be right. As Christians, we have one great advantage. I know that I will find out the truth, hopefully a little later than sooner, but at some point, I will be in a place where the truth will be clear. And I'm sure that in many cases, when I hear what the final truth is, I'll say, look at that, I was right. But in far more cases, I'll say, oh my, I missed that one.
Well, I love that humility. And I think, that if people appreciate what other Christians bring to the table, then, we can find ways to get along even under strong disagreement.
Yes. Yes.
Because I disagree with you that evolution doesn't matter, but I appreciate what you bring to the table with your scientific knowledge and, with your faith. Like, I love your faith. I love your just, your whole story. And by the way, so does my mom. In fact, I told my mom, Garte's coming on my channel today. And my mom is very, very against evolution, but she loves you. And she's like, oh, good. I can't wait to see Garte. So, I think we need to appreciate that even if we have differing opinions and we have strong differences of opinion, we can still appreciate what each other brings within the realm of Christianity. So, yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have any what did I miss from your book that you wanted to talk about that we haven't talked about?
I think I've mentioned everything. There are only 7 chapters. They're kind of long, but they cover each of these areas. There's one about evolution. There's one about unity, which I think I've talked about. Then there's one about, the act. I call it ACT, which is for agency, cognition, and teleology. Those one about how accurate self-replication is the key to life, inheritance. And then there's one on abiogenesis, the origin of life, on consciousness, and a wrap-up chapter that how all of this points to God, which I didn't talk about much, but I think it's implicit in all of this new biology that, of course, none of it proves God. You'll never get a scientific proof of God because science doesn't prove anything ever. But you will get evidence for God, because just like the fine-tuning of the cosmological constants, which does not prove God, but is very strong evidence for a creator, the idea that cognition, agency, and purpose are present in all of life, not just in higher animals, to me, that's absolutely evidence for a divine creator, because I don't see how that can happen, without. And, when the thing that bothers me the most that atheists say is there's no evidence for God. And that is such blatantly untrue, because they confuse evidence with proof. There'll never be proof. There isn't proof for anything. There isn't proof for evolution or gravity, by the way. Okay. Everything is evidence. And if it's a theory that is well supported by evidence, then all scientists will accept it, with maybe a few exceptions. But it's not proof. And there's no such thing, by the way, and this is an aside, there's no such thing as extraordinary evidence, which is what Carl Sagan said. There is strong evidence and weak evidence, and that's the only thing you'll see in the literature. If you can find me an example of extraordinary evidence mentioned in any scientific publication, please let me know, and I'll change my view. And we have strong evidence for the existence of a divine creator, very strong evidence.
I agree. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. And I really love your writing. For those who haven't read Garte's books, he's a very good writer, and he really follows a logical progression. It's easy to read, even when it gets into the weeds on the science stuff. I think you bring it to a level that people can understand. So I really loved your book. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca.
It was awesome to connect with you today. Thanks everybody for watching, and please do check out Sai's book. The link to that is in the description of the video, and take care.